Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tablas Creek semi-weekly Instagram live broadcast. I'm Jason Haas, as always. My guest this week is Anna Brittain, who is the executive director at Napa Green and who I think is one of the most dynamic people in the world of sustainability and wine in California. And I cannot wait for you to meet her. But while we wait for people to join, as I always do, I want to share some pictures to show what's going on here at Tablas. So basically, the big news is that we are into bud break. We were only slightly out when we had a frost event come through 2 weeks ago. We did sustain some damage, not a huge amount. I'll show you a couple of things that hit us. So, like here is an example of a Grenache bud where the one at the bottom was fine, the one at the top was frozen. It often feels just capricious. I also have a good example of a vine where you can see that the primary buds were frozen and secondary buds are sprouting. So we estimate that we might have taken, 5 to 10% damage, but luckily most of the things at the tops of the hills didn't freeze, and most of the things at the bottom of the hills were dormant and in fact are still dormant. You can see this is a bottom of the hill Grenache block where the Grenache isn't even out yet, and I have a one more block to show you. This is a Mourvedre block that looks like it could have looked 2 months ago, except the grass is that much deeper and we've got poppies blooming. It is stunning here. The wildflowers are going crazy. Here's a picture right outside our tasting room. It's just an absolutely lovely time of year. Another wildflower photo, some of the lupins that we have in one of our lower lying blocks. In the cellar, we are at the point where we're just trying to coax the last few things that haven't quite finished fermenting to make their way through. These are barrels that we're bringing outside each day to enjoy the nice, sunny, warm weather, then bringing them back in at night. We will do our best to get those last few things through, and then we will turn our attention to the reds. We're going to have César Perrin and a couple of the other members of the team from Famille Perrin here week after next. Okay, one last picture, because this is our most important arrival of the last couple of weeks. This is Alistair Collins, so Austin Collins' second son, Neil's third grandchild, who was born a couple days ago and just arrived at the winery, arrived at their house here on the property yesterday. So anyway, that is far and away our most important news. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to invite Anna to join. And there, I see her there. I'm sending through the invitation. And all this will work as it's supposed to.
Yeah.
Hello, Anna.
There I am. Hi there. Look at that cute little baby.
I know. I mean, there's news and then there's real news.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So brand new. So brand new.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is spring. It's the time of renewal and new life and everything else.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much for having me today.
Awesome. It's my pleasure. It looks like our connection is only okay, not great. I see you a little blurry and the voice is a little distorted. I don't know if you have a spot nearer to Wi-Fi or anything that might make it better, or if we just trust that it will be fine. Now it has frozen. Hopefully this is just a temporary thing. If anybody who is watching, if you can comment, if you can see me, and if the freeze is on Anna's end, that would be useful to see in a comment. Oh,
Am
you're
I
back? Yes, and you look
okay.
clearer.
Is it
also.
better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I wasn't on the network. I'm on the network.
Excellent.
Technical issues.
Cool. Okay. Excellent. So for the people who didn't get my intro, I I am thrilled to have Anna Brittain joining me, Executive Director of Napa Green, founder of the Napa Rise conference, lots of other cool stuff, and which I didn't realize until I was doing the research for this talk, fellow Williams College alum.
Oh, I didn't realize that either. Yes.
I would have figured that we would have talked about that if we had realized it before now. So
that's funny. And East, a fellow East.
There are not a lot of us out here in the world of California wine. I'm only aware of one other. Do you know Tim Snyder of Fest Parker is the only one that I know who's out here.
I know one other person locally, but yeah, it's pretty rare on the West Coast for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so you grew up in Napa Valley. I'm wondering, was your family in the business? Was wine something that was a part of your life growing up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to start with. So we moved around a lot, but I did mostly grow up in the Napa Valley, but absolutely not in wine. And actually, I'm a candid person. Actually, we were very poor. And so it was interesting to grow up in a region surrounded by a lot of wealth, and especially growing wealth, throughout the 90s when I was becoming more cognizant of the world. The immense, how much St. Helena has changed and Yountville has changed and Napa has changed in that time. You didn't even used to want to go to Napa. Now it's like Anthropologie and Lululemon all over the place. So we were not in the industry. I just had a single mother. She's a picture framer. She was for over 20 years. And so it was interesting. I was going to school with Mondavis and Delgados, and that just wasn't a world that I was in.
What was your opinion of kind of the wine industry as you were growing up?
I say this a lot when people ask about why did you go to Williams? So it's funny you already brought that up. I felt like this was a pretty insular bubble. Like a lot of people didn't leave. I had it was a limited teenager perspective, but I felt like a lot of people never got away, got a bigger world perspective. And so I felt like I'm leaving and I'm never going back. So I had no intention of ending up in the wine industry and of ending up in Napa, and here I am.
That's interesting. That gives me a certain amount of hope because I have a 19-year-old who is in college at Middlebury right now. With one of his stated goals again was to get away from what he knew growing up.
Yeah.
And we'll see if he finds his way back.
Yeah.
So at Williams, I read that you studied political science and environmental studies.
Yeah.
Did you know at that point that the environment, you wanted to make that a focus of your career?
I definitely knew that was absolutely what I wanted to do. I had a really pivotal moment. I don't think you were there at our first symposium where we had Bill McKibben come and talk, which was really incredible. I had a pivotal moment in college where I was reading his book, The End of Nature, which really focused on the climate change to come and the climate crisis to come. And I just had an emotion, a really emotive moment. I remember stopping on campus in the middle of campus and saying, this is what I have to do with the rest of my life. I didn't know it would be in the wine industry, and it hasn't always been in the wine industry, but I've always worked on environmental management and policy in some capacity.
Yeah, can you actually talk about that? What was your path from having studied that to getting back to California to deciding to focus on wine and particularly wine sustainability?
Well, tell that story as quickly as I can, and you can tell me what's more interesting to dig into. But my first job out of college was in DC working on green building, actually. So LEED and certifications like that. So an early introduction to certifications. But then I actually went abroad to Vietnam. And I came back and I was on just a summer layover before starting my master's in environmental science at Yale in 2006. And I was just looking for a summer internship experience. And I ended up connecting with John Garn, who was a consultant that specifically worked on sustainable wine growing. And so I just got this sort of unexpected little into this world of sustainable wine growing and consulting with groups like the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, and then with individual wineries like Benziger, Mike Benziger, incredibly inspiring. And so just really developed this interest around that, and went out to Yale, and honestly, I just hated New Haven, and I was just kind of locked in. And so I came back and worked with John for a few years and ultimately finished my master's at UC Santa Barbara. and spent some more time working in DC, working internationally, again in Vietnam and in Switzerland. And I just really came to the conclusion that the way you can make the most change, and we could debate this, but I felt like was boots on the ground, was working locally, working directly with people, hand in hand. And so I came back and I started working. I'd actually been a consultant that helped develop the Napa Green winery program back in 2008 when I was working with John, but came back in 2015 and became the consultant really helping to grow the program at that time.
Right. So, and that was, you've been executive director at Napa Green since 19, am I right?
Yeah. So Napa Green used to be under the auspices of the Napa Valley Vintners, but we became an independent nonprofit right at the end of 2019, which was a really interesting time to become an independent nonprofit.
So can you introduce Napa Green as an organization to people who might not know it?
Yeah, so Napa Green is one of, I know this because I've done a lot of looking at this around the world. We're one of approximately 20 sustainable wine growing programs developed specifically for the wine industry. And a little bit of what sets us apart is, we're soil to bottle. So we're not just looking at the vineyard, which some programs do. We have standards for the vineyard, more than 100 standards that our members have to implement in the vineyard. But then we also have more than 120 standards that people have to implement in the winery. And we've really, something that set us apart the last few years, and I know you're passionate about this and we've talked about this, is we've really made social justice, diversity, and inclusion foundational. So it's one of the 6 elements of each of our vineyard and winery programs. And it's been interesting to have a lot of conversations around that the last few years because a lot of people still don't think of that as part of sustainability. And so really having that conversation around if we don't have social sustainability, we're not going to get people involved in helping us have environmental sustainability or economic sustainability if people don't feel cared for and listened to. So that's very core to our program. And I think just as I've heard over the last few years, like sustainability is confusing. It doesn't have a clear definition. Is it greenwashing? Is it real? Does it mean anything? What I came up with as like my best attempt at an elevator pitch of what we see as leadership is this 6 pillars of sustainable wine growing leadership. So what we're focused on is water efficiency, energy efficiency, waste prevention and supply chain, regenerative farming and soil health, and social justice, diversity, and inclusion, and all of that sort of under this umbrella of climate action and regenerative agriculture. That's my quick intro.
Ooh, okay. There's a ton to dig in there. Okay, I'm going to ask you kind of a 2-part question. So I guess the first part is, what do you think of all of those pieces? What do you think is the biggest challenge facing California wine? And then the second part of that question is, I guess, what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the sustainability challenge? Because they're sort of different. Like, what are the big sustainable, and I'm not interested, like, is there in the sustainability sphere is my question. The biggest challenge and then the lowest hanging fruit.
I guess I'd say 2 pieces as the biggest challenge. I mean, A is that anyone in agriculture needs to be treating climate resiliency, building climate resiliency as like a #1 priority. And it's incredible to me how much we still don't see that happening. There's still a lot of this, I can just operate the way I've always operated, a lot of inertia, a lot of, I think that's the biggest challenge is inertia, just this is the way I've always done it. How do I learn to do something new? And then also I would say that social justice, diversity and inclusion element. I mean, again, I'm a candid person. This remains, an overwhelmingly white and male industry, and a lot of work to do around drawing in more diversity and inclusion and younger people into being engaged in this. I would say biggest opportunities, kind of the same. But another one I would say, and one that you've worked on a lot, is around packaging and distribution. Because we know I've worked on inventories, I've seen many greenhouse gas inventories. We know that packaging and distribution is 40 to 50% of our emissions in this industry. So even if you can't invest in one of those geeky inventories, that's a place to work on. And it's definitely an area, especially in really luxury regions like the Napa Valley, where there's a lot of opportunity to lighten glass weight, to get rid of wood boxes, to, change out packaging, to reduce shipments, to reduce the weight of shipments, and to reduce emissions. The last thing I'll say too is around energy efficiency. It always surprises me that people don't get more engaged in that, because it's your number one way to save costs. And energy is rising through the roof here in California. So it's interesting how we're out there trying to help people improve efficiency, and they're like, well, how do you really help me save money? And it's like, how do I help you save money? I mean, come on. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity.
I mean, that's one of the take-home messages for me in all of these discussions, is that, like, in general, resources have costs. Yeah. I mean, yes, people should be trying to reduce their use of all these different resources, whether that's water, whether that is something like glass, whether that's energy. I mean, whatever it is,
right.
Like, the reason that, like, you pay for these as a business, and so the work towards greater efficiency and greater sustainability almost always comes in the long run with a reduction of costs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you pointed out, just around your glass, what did you say, over $2 million over 10 years in savings? Yeah, I mean, it's
huge. And we actually found another glass supplier where we're going to be lightening our bottles another like 15% this year, from like 465 grams down to 400 grams.
I love it.
And it's another significant savings. It really is one of the things we looked at. We're like, oh, like, yeah, we're going to have to pay for the new mold, but the paying for the new mold is going to pay for itself in like 4 months. It's like so fast for that ROI.
I have to just say quickly, just because here we are, that I was just speaking up at the Live annual meeting last month. The Live's the Oregon Sustainable Wine Growing Program. Specifically, we were talking about packaging and distribution, and I used Tablas Creek as a case study like 4 times in my presentation. So you were everywhere in that presentation, just so you know.
Thank you. That's great. So let's talk about Napa Rise a little bit. I had the pleasure of being invited up to speak at last year's conference. But there was one, that wasn't the first one. There was at least one before that.
First one. We started in 2022. Okay. Yeah.
Can you?
Just to be really confusing, we started with a different name. It had to change. We won't go into that story, but the concept has remained the same. We really felt like there was an opportunity to create just a really world-class climate and wine symposium. I think about this, why do I work on this in this industry? Because we're kind of at the peak of the agricultural pyramid. We get noticed, we get media attention in a way corn and soy and wheat don't. And so our leadership really gets attention and can create a lot of bigger change. And so we wanted to create a really world-class symposium, but also just not one of those things, so many of those things we go to that it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of inspiring. I kind of learned something. Okay, I'm like overwhelmed 3 days straight, too much information. Now I'm going home and going back to what I normally do. So we really wanted to try to create something that was, as much as possible, very action and impact oriented and kind of dosable. So what it is a series of 6 half-day events organized around those same 6 pillars of sustainable wine growing leadership. So each half-day you're really digging in on one of these core topics: water, or waste prevention, or climate action more broadly. And we have about 70 speakers per event, and bring in a lot of really relevant sustainability services and tools. And we had 750 guests last year. So yeah, we've done it twice, 22, 23, huge undertaking. So we're going to do it every other year moving forward. So it's happening again at the end of April and early May in 2025.
I was worried as I was preparing for this. I was looking back and was like, oh, it happened in April. Did I miss this year's announcement? I found on the website happening in 5. So you saved me from this like moment of panic.
Yeah, it's every other year, and you'll absolutely be invited.
Excellent. So Napa Green recently made some pretty big news by announcing that it would be the first of the certified sustainability programs to require the phase out of glyphosate.
Yeah.
I guess I want to know both kind of what was behind that decision and how it's been received.
Yeah, so a teeny bit of background detail is that originally there was a Napa Green land program that was really focused on erosion and sediment control, because we had a lot of erosion and kind of water quality issues. And then ultimately what happened is what you want to have happen. That became a regulatory requirement. The water board said, that's what you got to do just to be a good actor. And so we decided to completely redevelop at that point our Napa Green Vineyard program. So it's now Napa Green Vineyard. It's still a whole property certification. But we relaunched that in 2021. And one of the 6 elements of that is prohibited and restricted pesticide. And of course, that took an immense amount of time to evaluate and consider. We had a pesticide working group. And we certainly talked about the beginning about this most known herbicide, right? Roundup. This is the one where there's a lot of consumer and media attention. Should we prohibit its use? We were coming out with a brand new, super rigorous, very challenging certification. And the pesticide working group conversation was really just prohibiting Roundup isn't enough. People will just switch to other herbicides that no consumer or journalist has ever heard of and no one asks any questions about. And so at that point, we decided to stick with this prohibited and restricted pesticide list and have a restriction on the use of Roundup and other herbicides, but we didn't prohibit it. And kind of go from there, try to bring people into the fold, get them involved, and see how this is all about continuing improvement, right? You're never done. This is a journey. And so as we came up with, 2 years later, it's time to re-up and edit the standards and make some additions. This conversation came up, and at that point, we really felt like we were losing more than we were gaining by leaving that opportunity open to some growers. And it was a big conversation. Working group, our board, obviously had to agree to this. But we did decide that ultimately what we're going to do is require the phase out of all glyphosate-based products, which includes Roundup, by January 1st, 2026. But then ultimately, the more important whole system conversation is ultimately all synthetic herbicides by January 1st, 2028. Because what we already see just in the North Coast, we see that Roundup going like this. People have read the marketing on the wall, like we have to get rid of Roundup. But we see things like Lifeline going like this. So other herbicides that are ranked just as risky in some cases as Roundup. And so we're trying to have that bigger conversation where it's not just that, of course, that's an important element, but it's a bigger conversation.
Do you have a sense of what percentage of the wineries that you're certifying are using the systemic herbicides at this point? How many are going to have to make this change?
We did all that analysis when we made the announcement in November. So don't quote me on this because I'm not going to remember it perfectly. But I want to say on average in Napa County, it's about 60% of growers are still using Roundup. Of our members, it's more like 35%. So it's smaller than the average in the county, but it's still, a third or more of people in the program are transitioning to the program, are using it. I think, so you asked about response. Response has been overwhelmingly positive. Media, obviously, hugely supportive. All our champion members that are really already not using Roundup or are organic, very excited about this. We definitely haven't really heard yet from the growers that might be questioning a little bit more, but I think in conversations we've had, I think almost all growers understand that Roundup has to go away. It's then this question of, am I just switching over to other herbicides? And so I think that first phase out deadline isn't going to be such a challenge with our members, but that second all synthetic herbicides is going to be a bigger challenge.
It's been interesting to see the extent to which that's been changing down here, like even absent a requirement from a program that people are a part of. It used to be at this time of year, well, it's a little later, people are starting to clean things up, but like you drive out in February or March and it's super clear who's using herbicide and who is not. And it used to be that like we would pass, like on a way out from where I live, you'd pass the Turley's vineyards that have been organic, and those would be all green. And then every vineyard you passed between there and Tablas Creek would have these rows of bare dirt under the vines. And then you be green again. And now it's like half and half. There's been a huge amount of movement on this over the last decade, even so. And I think that has to be the case before a program like Napa Green can require something like that. And I don't know. I'm going to be watching. I'm sure everyone is watching what the decisions are from the people who are currently using herbicides, whether they are going to make the changes, whether they're going to I don't know, push back somehow, leave the program or something like that. But
Yeah.
it's got to happen, and that's sort of the first step, I think, for people to get into just a less interventionist, more organic sort of approach.
Well, and that awareness is increasing, but has to keep increasing. I was actually walking with my boyfriend by a vineyard. He's not in the wine industry. And I said, do you know what that orange strip is under the vine? And he said, no. I said, well, that's Roundup. And he said, oh, now that I saw it, I can't unsee it. Like now I'm going to know everywhere I go. So building that awareness and that then questions that get asked, like, why is that there? Do you have alternatives? So yeah, I think there's a lot of unfolding conversation right now.
Totally. Do you have a sense if other of the sustainability organizations in California are going to follow suit?
I haven't heard any word of that. No, I haven't heard. That's all I can say. I haven't heard if there's a direction on that.
Because obviously that's going to be super interesting. I'm sure they're all watching really closely what happens, and I hope they're thinking about following suit. But I guess
I do too. Yeah. I shared the announcement with them in advance of going public with it. We all talk, the SIP program and California Sustainable Wine Growing and Lodi Rules. So we all know each other well and connect. But yeah, I haven't had a lot of kind of direct engagement with them on this.
Are you considering a similar sort of move with synthetic pesticides? I mean, I know there are already restrictions based on the integrated pest management program, but there's a difference between restrictions and requiring people to move away from it. What have you?
Yeah, I mean, we have a really extensive list of prohibited, especially pesticides. I mean, I forget the exact number, but it's a huge number of prohibited pesticides. And then what we did was we just looked at anything that really still had any use in Napa County and things that had risk. And so there's very few things that we're just having a restriction around. And I think that at this point we're not imagining going towards requiring organic. I think that feels like a push too far, and that we would only have a small number of people involved in the program who would be everyone that's organic right now. So we're working across 6 elements of the vineyard, across water and energy and regenerative farming and social justice. And so we just feel like that we're not pushing that envelope quite yet of requiring organic.
I feel like the most recent sort of wave in sustainability has been kind of focus on carbon footprint. I mean, just think of the difference between what people were talking about even 5 years ago and what they're talking about now.
Yeah.
Do you see the same thing? And if so, what do you think is going to be the next frontier in sustainability and wine?
Yeah, I definitely see that there are more and more people really paying attention to that carbon footprint, those emissions. What am I generating in terms of emissions? How do I evaluate that? Especially what's called the scope 3, right? Which is everything beyond energy use, all the much tougher stuff to track around packaging and commute and travel and, all the much more complicated elements. A lot more interest we're seeing with people of kind of trying to get a hold on that and understand that and see where their biggest opportunities are. So yeah, absolutely. That's a movement right now. Also just around pairing that with trying to really understand the carbon sequestration in the vineyard. So understanding the relationship between soil health and biodiversity and cover crops and compost and all of the benefits that has, right, for water and nutrient retention and resilience and bees and butterflies, but also, this ability to store carbon in the soil. And really be a part of that solution of drawing down carbon. And that's really been identified as one of the lead ways to address the climate crisis. The wine industry, again, being a small piece of the agricultural puzzle, but I think we can really show a leadership example around that. So that's a big part of what we're working with growers on. And I think I see more and more movement around that as well. I think our next biggest frontier is like doing a much better job of telling these stories. I mean, Tablas Creek does a great job of it, but being transparent and telling stories and helping consumers to understand what this means and why it matters. And I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is we see all kinds of evidence, whether wine industry studies or broader market studies, consumers want to support values-driven businesses by and large. Not everybody, but most people want to support values-driven businesses. But they're like, how do I just quickly figure out if you care? Like if you're doing, I just need something quick. And there's still this sort of resistance to putting the logos on the label or whatever it is, or having a description that just helps people quickly identify. And so we really need to do a better job of telling those stories, giving those quick cues, and especially as we're trying to engage. Hey, I'm a millennial, technically. Like we're not so young anymore, and you got to bring us into this industry. So these kinds of stories have to be told.
Yeah, and I think wine has a really amazing opportunity in that it is a product that comes from a place. And people are used to talking about the impact of the choices that are made in that place on the finished product. And the fact that it's never a compromise between like doing things the right way or making better wine. Like all of these things, all of this focus on soil health, this focus on biodiversity, this focus on social equity, like all of these things, they make better wine. They give you better opportunities to turn that soil into something memorable and remarkable. So I've been trying to make that case for a long time, that wine has an incredible opportunity here to lead in this super important transition.
Right, and consumers come to us and sit down with us, whereas like a corn farmer does not have that. Someone is not coming to you and sitting down and walking through your farm with you. So there's an incredible communications opportunity here.
Amazing. So I have about like a full more page of questions that I wanted to ask you. Well,
what's the biggest one?
It is 12:30. I do try to keep these to a half an hour.
Okay.
So I guess just one. I guess one real question, and then one just like how do people find out more question. But the real question is sort of what's next for you? What are you looking forward to diving into in the next year to 5?
I think one thing that we're exploring, because there's a lot of interest, is potentially going beyond Napa. There's interest from surrounding counties in us bringing, especially because we haven't talked about this, but Napa Green is really unique in doing consulting services essentially with our growers and our wineries. So we're doing carbon farm plans, we're doing irrigation assessments, we're doing resource assessments at the wineries. So there's a big demand for these services that we provide, and so we're exploring, but this is a huge capacity issue and other communications issue. But that's a direction we might be going on, is sort of broadening our services. And I think that's something we're exploring most deeply right now.
Ooh, that's exciting. Cool. Can't wait to hear if that happens. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how do people who want to either kind of follow your own journey or learn more about Napa Green, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can definitely, so it's napagreen.org is our website. You could sign up for our newsletter. We really don't bombard people. That's every other month or so that we put that out, but it's a really good way to stay apprised of when Rise is happening. We're also doing all kinds of other workshops and trainings throughout the year, trying to record those when we can. So that's just a great way to stay up to date. But beyond that, go to napagreen.org, look at our events page. You're going to see all the stuff coming up and the videos that we have, and including, I think we got you recorded, Jason. So your recording's up there somewhere from Rise. So that's probably the best way. And then, just reach out anytime. Happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Excellent. Anna Brittain, thank you so much for taking a chunk out of your Wednesday afternoon and rearranging your schedule to do it. I appreciate it. And can't wait to hear what's next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jason, for your leadership. You're great.
My pleasure. Tablas folks, thank you for joining. I will be back in 2 weeks. I have as my next guest Yannick Benjamin, who is a great New York Somm, who's also done really cool stuff with advocating for people with disabilities within the New York restaurant and Somm world. So join us in 2 weeks, and otherwise I hope that spring where you are is as beautiful as it is here. So cheers, and thank you again, Anna. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.